We have one more important discussion before we close, and that is the critical importance of pilot training and the technologies behind it. There have been many discussions that RAA has led in Washington over the past 2 years about structured training. One key point that emerges from each is how absolutely imperative it is that pilot training keeps pace with changes in our environment and changes in the technology available to us. The difference for a pilot between simulator time and free time is tremendous. Right now, a new pilot can spend 1,000 hours flying the same pattern in non-complex aircraft in uncontrolled airspace at low altitude, developing habits that won't help in a multi-crew environment. Our panel will discuss this and more. Today's panel will be led by my colleague, Jennifer Iverson, who is Vice President of Aviation Operations and Regulatory Affairs for RAA, and will feature some of the most preeminent aviation safety and training voices of our industry. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer and her distinguished panelists to the stage.
You're all mic'd? Okay, yeah, any seat you want. This one?
Where are you?
Okay, I'll see.
Can you stand at the podium?
I was going to sit with you all, if that works. Okay. I think there's enough. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Faye, and thank you to my esteemed panelists up here for joining me for the last discussion of the day. We're really continuing the conversation that the Dream of Flight panel started. They were talking about how we help get pilots into the industry, and then now we're going to focus on how we can better train them. So I think really quick, just for the audience to put faces with everybody, if we could each introduce ourselves, just your name and what you do, that'd be helpful.
I'm Brett Thress. I'm the President and CEO of Flight Safety International.
Great. Jennifer Iverson with RAA.
Dan Elwell, Elwell and Associates, LLC.
Billy Nolan, Chief Safety Officer at Archer Aviation.
Michael D., Managing Director of Flight Operations, Republic Airways.
And Alan Hill, I'm the Director of Training for Envoy.
Okay, so to start, thank you all. To start our conversation, I just want to get a lay of the land of kind of the industry trends. I want to look at 10 years ago to even during the pandemic to now. So I'm going to start over with the operator side. I'm going to start with you, Michael, and then have you weigh in, Alan.
Okay. Wow, the footprint for regional carriers has changed significantly in the last 10 years. A lot of carriers have transitioned to an AQP program or just extended their N&O footprint. So what Republic has done and other carriers have done is they've invested heavily into the lower level training devices. So what you do now is you bring them into an FTD, and the FTD is more of a training environment because when we bring them into the simulator, now it's an evaluation period, and a lot of the knowledge that they gain seems to go out the window once they cross that bridge into the simulator. So the more you can train in a more of a classroom type of environment, the better prepared they are for the simulator. So Republic specifically, we have increased our footprint almost 2x to what we were doing 10 years ago. Not just because the quality of the candidate that's coming in the door is a little bit lower, but what we're training them to do is significantly different. It's no longer how well can you perform just a V1 cut. Now it's more of line-oriented scenarios where we're going to train them from point A to point B where something happens where they're going to have to think through the problem. And the critical thinking piece is something that takes a lot longer than it does to just train them to do a V1 cut.
Yeah, and for Envoy, we've had the similar challenge. We started off as a subpart N&O training program and advanced into the AQP, and we're fully phase 5 AQP now. And leveraging the technology with our virtual procedures trainers and our computer-based training to push as many of the lower level tasks as far to the left in the training program as we can so that we can use the full flight simulators for more critical thinking skills, loft scenarios, as Michael's talking about. So we do very much the same thing, but that's kind of the evolution of our program from 10 years ago to today. It's a very different training footprint and obviously a longer footprint.
Yeah, I'm hearing that it takes longer to train them, but you're training them to do more. Really important. In the In the US, we've really led in global aviation. And to keep that lead, we're looking at, in this panel, the new technologies and how to really train our pilots to do better. Without falling behind, Dan and Billy, I was hoping you could share the threats and opportunities out there with the training technology and getting it into the airline training operations.
Well, I think for both, well, definitely for me, maybe for Billy, I'm not going to speak for him. It's been a while since we've been in training academies, and but we've made it our business to sort of understand what's going on in the state of the art in training, and it is like all things in aviation right now, the technology is improving at a very rapid pace. You know, there's no doubt that the FAA and the US standards for becoming a pilot are much higher than anywhere else in the world. We already have that clearly with the experience level, 1,500-hour requirement, and the restricted ATP rules. And we're also making great advances in the technology of training. What we can do now with computers, you know, we get down now with training to the point where we can track a student's eye movement to make sure that their scan is right. We can do things in simulation that we, you know, back in our day was not even conceivable. The key is to leverage that amazing technology for better training, and like was already said, you want to focus where the student or the pilot in training, you want to focus in on what they need. You don't need to do 50 runs of something that the student has licked. You want to go after the areas where they need work. And the technology today zeroes in on what the student needs, and that's the advantage. I think as long as we're able to allow that training in the regulation and endorse it, we'll be in good shape.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, you know, so the arc of my career that I talked about a little bit this morning, a little bit different from Dan. So I spent the better part of my career at American Airlines heading flight safety. The last 5 years of my time there was as the executive manager of or managing director of corporate safety and regulatory affairs, all of the interface. And my time at Qantas was as the group safety, reporting into the group CEO and to the board, but sitting at that level, and the same for my time at WestJet. And so where am I going with this? The ability to look at training through the lens of safety management system, SMS, you had a real opportunity to see where were the pitfalls, where organizations were doing well, you know, bringing in FOCO data. Now you've got AQP data, you've got line-oriented safety training, LOSA data. So you've got all these data sources that give you a sense of how well, number one, how well you're doing in a macro as an airline, but also how well you're doing in a micro on an individual level. So we've come a long way, as been said by most of the folks here, right? So simulation has brought us a long way. So our ability to absolutely nail down what we've seen is a rapid uptake in terms of evidence-based training on the part, especially on the part of international airlines. And this is very, very much a key focus at the Qantas Group and a key focus at WestJet, right? So tools like evidence-based training, and then how far we've come, which for me, starting out at American Airline, with a one-dimensional paper panel on my hotel wall, we've come a long way to how far technology is going. So if I think about where we were to where we are, just in 10 years' time, SMS were introduced in 2012, mandated by 2018. Now it's on the part of the industry as well as OEM. So we've got way more data that tells us how well we're doing and also tells us the kind of things that we need to address. So I think this has come a long way. So when we cannot think about training outside the context of how it fits within an entire SMS for an organization.
It sounds like we have a lot of opportunity here. The technology is training rapidly, so we'll have to try to keep up. I'm going to turn over here to Brad. Is there an opportunity to bring this new technology and ideas into possibly the FAA reauthorization to help open up the pilot pipeline?
Yeah, I think that yes is the answer to the question, and there's a whole host of ideas around how do you take an aspiring professional aviator and give them the richest, most impactful, background as they build their experience. At Flight Safety, we think, and we know the data proves it, that an hour of Level D full flight simulator training is much more valuable than an hour in a single engine airplane in visual conditions. So we're big advocates of the reauthorization bill, maybe giving more credit for some of the simulator training that these young aspiring professional aviators build. But on the technology side, we're doing all the things that Billy and Dan just mentioned. With respect to the sim can tell you a successful V1 cut looks like this on the controls, and you're doing this. So it's no longer a guess. The data tells you exactly where the student falls, and so all that can be incorporated to make the training more effective and make the student more successful.
Yeah, it really sounds like using it will help create a more proficient pilot. So with the challenges in the workforce and the importance of the pipeline, there's a work group in the ACT-ARC looking at specifically that, the pipeline pathways and partnerships to bringing more pilots in. We are lucky enough to have our co-chair of that work group, Michael D. So how can we leverage the ACT-ARC to help solve the industry-wide workforce problems?
Well, I think the ACT-ARC, excuse me, is in a unique position. The FAA comes to the ACT-ARC and asks us to help solve some problems, and industry comes to the ACT-ARC and asks them to as well additionally solve some problems. The ACT-ARC consists of industry experts across the entire United States aviation, whether it's flight safety, CAE, A4A, ALPA, the RAA. So everybody's in one room trying to solve the same problems. And in the case of the pilots pathways partnerships, it's first we have to figure out what's out there. And it turns out that there is a lot out there and none of it is standardized. So the first question we are trying to solve is how do we make pilots understand what they're signing up for? If you show up at a Part 61 flight school with the intention of becoming an airline pilot, is that the best way for you to pursue your dream? Or is there other avenues out there, whether there's an ATP or a 4-year school or an Aviate or a Lift Academy? And then if they do take advantages of things like Aviate and Lift Academy, where the training is designed to train you to be in the right seat of a regional carrier or even a mainline carrier, how different do you make that training? So the P3 working group is focused on what does that transition look like? What guidelines do we have within the framework of the regulations today that will allow us to do that? And there was a proposal that the FAA did see years ago with EQP, which addresses some of those issues, which takes advantage of what Brad was talking about, the simulation quality. And then the question that we still need to solve is, how many hours of simulation time does that equal to flying around in a single engine airplane? And then if we train the individual for the mission, just the same way the military does, what does that look like? So that's one thing that the P3 working group is really focused on. The ACT-ARC itself is also, they're probably their biggest piece that they have brought forward is now the Flight Path Monitoring Advisory Circular, which was done through years of work. That's probably the longest working group that we've had, but their advisory circular came out earlier this year, which is really good. They have, from a flight attendant standpoint, they have high energy fires that they have been working on, which has sent a lot of information over to the FAA testing in Atlantic City about how to handle lithium-ion battery fires that occur in airplanes. So these are the things that the ACT-ARC is working on to help the FAA improve safety and training in the industry.
Yeah, if I could add on to that too, I think the ACT-ARC has been a great body, done a lot of good work. And what Mike's talking about highlights, Billy and I and a bunch of other former FAA leaders wrote a letter to Commerce on sim time, on the credit for sim time. Everybody on this panel, and I think probably everybody in the room would say, Brad's already said it, an hour in a level D sim is so much more valuable than an hour in a 172 solo to get your time. But we're not the only ones saying that. Actually, some of the critics who are against adding sim time or who are against EQP credit have that agreement. They agree. And it's in the RATP. It's in the restricted ATP. We all agree that 750 hours in the military, which is how I got my ATP, or how I got into flying through the military before the 1,500-hour rule became. But we've already agreed that 750 hours in the military training is equivalent to 1,500 hours in civilian prep. So in the macro, we're saying an hour isn't an hour. There are differences in our training paradigms. And so what we said in our letter was not, actually, though it may sound like an attack on 1,500 hours, it's not attacking 1,500 hours. What we're saying is technology is advanced. It's way past time for us to give more credit towards pilot training preparation in a simulator. And I hope that comes out in this panel.
But Jennifer, if I can add to that,
Yeah.
I think through with SMS, like Billy was talking about, what I would like to see in the next 5 years is for the FAA not to rely on hours to be the standard of whether that person is a quality pilot or not. We have thousands of points of data in an airline training environment today that we can then determine if a pilot is qualified regardless of the number of hours that pilot has. Why don't we leverage data going forward than the way Orville and Wilbur measured proficiency?
Yes, it sounds like the mission matters in training. So if we're training a commercial pilot, it should look different than if somebody's just wanting a recreational license to go out on Sundays. And we heard earlier from Dev Collins on the Dream of Flight panel about how we train pilots in the sims, and then their first revenue flight is the first time they're actually seeing and flying the aircraft. So today, pilots are trained to handle catastrophic events in sims. Is there room to include sims and FTDs to go beyond how they're currently used, to keep up with the technology and continuously make more effective pilots as we go?
Yeah, well, I think the obvious answer to that is yes. It's all about how you use it, and to the point made, right? The ability to leverage data, and I may have it off by a little bit, right? But take a Boeing 787 has got nearly half a terabyte of data coming off of it per segment. Airbus A350 has got nearly a terabyte. So I think a couple of things are in play, right? The ability to be able to work together. So within an airline, there's just interplay between management and their labor groups to the extent that they have one. How that ability to use data never in a punitive way. So the question is, can we leverage data? The answer to that is obviously yes. How fast and how quick? This is a good example. Is there anyone, and there are a lot of airline folks in the room today, is anyone who have an EFB that your pilots have come to you and says, I'd really rather go back to paper. I really want to carry a 50-pound kit bag and be able to have a coffee stain 10-9 page, as we just call them at American Airlines, right? No one is offering that. So we've seen the role of technology and that's just one little, of course, little anecdote and a little example, right? But by extension, I'll just give you another example. That was me personally. I can recall being in a sim session, and whenever tech airman says, or a training captain say, hey, I'm going to give you something, you just handle it the best way you can, it's not going to be something good, right? But anyway, that's kind of what happened. And as it turns out, at the time, I was, first officer on a 767, and the incident that I had not experienced up at that point was a thrust reverser deployment in flight. Right? And so airplane starts to roll, and if you're just not keyed in on the engines, you've got, all right, both engines are running, you're rolling, you can't arrest the roll with full opposite rudder and full opposite aileron, right? We get about 70 degrees. All right, okay, let's kind of diagnose that, right? So that is the kind of training that's absolutely invaluable, and the ability for us to train mental and muscle memory that we saw a little bit of a lapse of during the pandemic, but the ability of airlines to be able to put their crews back in simulator session and go dust off the cobweb, right? And dust off the rust, this is how far we've come. So it is let's move beyond kind of this argument, can we use it? To Dan's point, that ability to say, how much credit should we give with the level of fidelity with which simulators have come today? And as you think about the evolving, sectors of the market, eVTOLs, CTOL, et cetera, we're really leveraging technology from VR and AR, and the ability of that to then produce what these two gentlemen talking about, give us a pilot that's fully trained, that has judgment and decision making, so that by the time they come to Envoy or Republic or elsewhere, right, they're ready to go and they've got a level of competence that technology can help solve for.
And I know, Brad, you want to weigh in
Yeah,
here.
I just wanted to say there's another whole facet of the data argument, which is instead of training the regulatory requirements and check,
Yep.
we aggregate FOQA data, we look at accident data, and we determine what causes the accidents. And we build these really compelling scenarios around runway excursions, number one cause. But the challenge becomes we still have the regulatory requirements to check off, so we have a limited time to do the things that are actually hurting people in the airplane. So it becomes a little bit of a bottleneck. So what we do with that is we actually create augmented courses that are beyond the regulatory requirement, which is more scheduled time or not in the normal routine of the pilot, so it's a little more challenging. But I think there's not only the airplane on the data on the airplane, but there's also a whole body of data that can inform what you train as well as how you train it.
So important. And I know that Envoy, you guys are doing a lot in this area of multiple parts to get to the sim.
Yes, we recently we increased our footprint. Well, not recently, but in the past 5 years, we've increased our footprint quite a bit to take advantage of the technology for these virtual procedures trainers. And our virtual procedure trainer footprint is exactly the same number of events that our sim is. And so the pilots have the opportunity to mechanically work through the checklists and emergency procedures and their flows and so forth. And then we spend more time in the simulator working on the more complicated decision-making skills, aviation decision-making and those other type loft scenarios to get that pilot up to speed, per se, on those soft skills that it takes to fly an airliner.
We've seen that where in the old days you would spend the first hour of simulator time learning to start the engine. And now you can do that in a lower level device, get in and be productive in the sim.
Yeah,
on session one.
and absolutely, when I talked about earlier, moving as many tasks to the left in the footprint as possible, our next, item that we're looking at, as Billy was talking about, is the VR concept of flight deck flows in the VR world, so that we spend less time in the virtual procedures trainers learning the flows, just like we took them out of the simulator and put them in the virtual procedures trainers. Now we're going to try to take that and move it down into the VR world so that we can take better advantage of our virtual procedures trainer.
I like it. There's so much there to unpack here, but continuing down the line, using the technologies and the sims, what have you seen so far that best enhances pilot skill levels? We'll start with Dan,
Okay.
and then we'll go down.
Well, I think we've been touching on this. First of all, simulators are excellent for working on those things that you can't do in an airplane. And simulators today do it real well. A number of years ago, we had a summit at National Airport on training. And then Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, described to the audience what the Air Force, who we recognize as the penultimate, military in general, the penultimate pilot training. She said, when I was going through pilot training, you'd go into a simulator, they were so rudimentary, you go into a simulator to be introduced to a maneuver once or twice, and then you'd go in your T-37, your T-38, and you go up in the airspace and do 10 sorties to really hone it. They've completely flipped that around in the Air Force. They'll do 7, 8, sorties in a sim and just go up in the airplane, one or two, make sure you got it, because the sims are that good. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but I tell you, you can recreate just about anything that a pilot's going to introduce in a Cat D simulator. And to Billy's point, then you can replay it. And I know how many debriefs have you had with the instructor where you're sitting down at the table. No, I didn't do that. I didn't. Yeah, you did, and it's memory, and it's in a simulator. There's no hiding. You see every single thing you did.
Yeah, I would add to that. Again, we're talking about data, and especially, this is, RAA Leaders Conference, right? So within your organization, and then certainly, at a micro, but at a macro level, when we think about it nationally, right? Our ability, so think about where we are. So the FAA, again, Dan and I have pinned a lot of things as we both sit in the chair, but the flight path management, it is, if anything is going to kill somebody, it's going to be around flight path management, right? So imagine Asiana 214 on a Saturday morning. I was at the gym on a treadmill when that happened, watching that, or at least watching the aftermath and sort of the replay. Or 2009 when we had everything from, Kogan 3407 to the Miracle on the Hudson to Air France 447 to American 331. So if you look at the arc in 2009, there were 29 major commercial airline accidents. We have come so far in terms of our ability to advance, much of that which was the catalyst not only for standing up a SIAS, not only for continuing to move forward with training in terms of how we do it, right? So across as an industry, that ability to go back and say, what did we learn? Why did we learn it? We still see a few incidents happen today, but here's the difference. We have the ability almost instantaneously as an airline or even as an industry to input that scenario as Brad talked about, right back into our training. I mean, so when it's immediate, you don't have to wait 9 months or a year before you get it back into a cycle. So that ability to have the kind of fidelity that we have in simulators, combined with all of the learnings that we get from the just sheer volumes of data. There's still parts of the world that we have to convince into having a strong data governance model, so there is more and more sharing. But Dan hit the point home, right? There is no debate or argument that we are saying that a military pilot is worth, he can do it in 750 hours. Why? If we back out the combat training and all of that, we say it is judgment, it is decision making, it is the ability to operate under stress with a cascading sort of failures, right, or any combat scenario. You can introduce much of that, absence the combat context of it, into everything you're doing with evidence-based training or an AQP environment today. So you can have all of the benefits of how the military produces really incredible pilots, and we could have that same kind. And so that's what I would love to see the ACT ARC take on, and they are doing some really, really good work saying, what is the model? What is the standardized training model that embraces much of the training we see? Again, 2 military pilots here. So that we can begin to build, so that is less of a rock being moved around and polished, right? And more of a well-qualified product coming to the front door, first maybe at the regionals or fractionals, and then, of course, ultimately into mainline operators.
Okay, so we've got all the data and the tech, and a lot of us agree that there's huge benefits. But how can we overcome the political views that are stated as safety concerns? I'm going to start with you, Dan.
No, thanks. I think, in my view, there's been more political activity in the aviation space in this country than there ever was in the beginning of my career. And that's unfortunate. I don't know how you remove it. I mean, in all parts of the world and government, there are political obstacles that the advocates for what is right, shake their fist at. We got to get rid of it. We got to get rid of it. The fact is, as a wise bureaucrat recently told me, politics is in everything. I think what we need to do as a body and as an industry is to speak truth to our principles, our safety, our aviation principles. Start with safety and go from there. And I'm still not that cynical that if you speak truth about safety and about aviation, it sort of discolors the political arguments. And so that's really all we can do. I wish I had a better answer.
If I may, I would add to that. You think about how we leverage data. So you look around the world, most of the world today, and a lot of countries and a lot of airlines have ab initio programs. In my time at Qantas, they had 2 pilot academies, right? So you've got an ab initio that is producing a pool of pilots for the Qantas group, another pool of pilots for the world in general. We have the ability to compare, do a like-for-like comparison, and we could easily say, are we seeing a difference, right? The good book I love called Courage is the Backbone of Leadership. This is a moment for us to think about, to be courageous, but it's an informed level of courageousness, right? We've got more data than we've ever had. Our ability to look at that and say, does it work or doesn't it work? I know if I talk to some of you in the room, some of you will say, well, I got pilots with 5,000 hours and they're about as bad as someone who just came to me from, if they had come fresh off the street from a Riddle or University of North Dakota or SIU, et cetera. So it is a quality, it is the consistency, and it's the standardization of that training model. And granted, we heard from Senator Cruz this morning. I've had conversations with Congressman Graves, had conversations on both with Congressman Larson, right? There is a body of saying, we have some ability to do it. They obviously want to be purposeful. Regulators are conservative by nature, but they can be moved with data, right? And so our ability to take this data and then put it in a compelling way is, I think, a pathway that we can use to get there.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm just going to echo it right there. I hate to keep saying data, but if you look at the evidence or the truth, it really should set us free. I mean, did the accident crew have this accident because they had too few hours or because they weren't trained adequately in the situation that presented itself that day? So I think you'll always find it's B, and we got to just be honest about that.
Jennifer, it's no secret that all of the rules that got put in place following Colgan, none of those rules would have stopped those 2 pilots from flying that airplane that day together. Nothing. They met all of the metrics that were then put in place, and they still.
With the possible exception of pilot record database, which was the one thing of the 10, the last thing implemented.
That was actually implemented.
But the one thing of the 10 that really, really came to bear.
So it sounds like we need to be compelling with our data. There's a lot of it, so it's going to be really focused and honing in on messaging and telling the story with the data. Alan, for you, the technology is progressive, but the training regulations haven't advanced quite at the same speed. So I wanted to ask you, are there opportunities that you see to incorporate the newer technologies and push them into the regulations and using the data that we can get?
Right. It's, as I mentioned earlier, the VR concept into our training program, the FAA doesn't, that I know of, have any kind of rules or regulations surrounding VR. And now the AQP allows you a certain amount of flexibility for approval within your program, not necessarily to get any kind of flight credit or anything. But we've been, very fortunate with our FAA office to have open and frank conversations about the new technology. And, quite frankly, they say, we're not really sure how to approve this under the current structure. And so, they say if you can prove up a very compelling case why you need this technology and what it does for you, we're happy to approve it. And so we've been very fortunate. They've almost green-lighted our VR discussion going forward, pending some formalities. But we're going to work towards that. So, moving forward as we, work on some of these committees to, come up with the regulatory requirements for these new technologies, I think it really has to focus on being open to the next set of changes the things we don't know at the moment that are going to be the future of training, and not limit the regulation like it is today, looking back 20, 30 years on technology, and we have no ability to approve the new technology in our programs. And so as long as there's a flexibility and an evenness across the industry for competitiveness, between the carriers, and I think that is the direction we need to continue to move.
If I could just add, I mean, it's really an excellent point. I think a vehicle that, if you think about how the FAA is addressing what the sector that I'm now in with eVTOLs and electrification, et cetera, and we heard from the last panel about alternative propulsion, hydrogen, et cetera. The FAA in 2018 stood up CC, the Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation, expressly to say where we have new and novel designs, let's create a team within the FAA to be able to look at that, address it, and to your point, say, oh, not quite sure how that's going to work. What's the certification basis? What's going to be the training pathway? And you know what? They nailed out. It took them a while to get there, but they did get there in terms of coalescing around a cert basis. They got there in terms of the SFAR. It's not done yet, and we'll see, and the industry has inputs. You could use a similar vehicle. I mean, certainly it should be the ACT ARC, but to the extent that you say, how do we take what's new, what's novel, be it, AR, VR, I'm going to be first in line to buy, the Apple Vision Pro here, right? How do we leverage this, and then how do you assess it from a regulatory perspective, right? To say, yep, does it work? Does it fit? Does it fit the bill, right? This is a thing. This is a pathway. I think that's something that we could talk to our legislators about. Let's have something, a model, so that we don't feel like we're stuck in time on the commercial Part 121 side as what we think of as airliners today. In the same way where we allow new and novel technologies, let's embrace that same kind of thinking here that could help move us forward in terms of how we address pilot shortages going forward.
Billy, I'm glad you brought up the new entrants, and Alan, with being open to what's next. As the eVTOLs come into the NAS, and the design is different, they don't have the dual controls,
yeah.
Exactly. So is this a good time to reevaluate training, proficiency, type of operation, and how even they're going to be getting cycles faster than ours? Is that something that we should look at on how it fits into the pilot pathway?
We absolutely have to. When you think about it, was mentioned on a previous panel, whether it be reserves, and when you think about it, I think of it all from a performance-based outcome, right, versus just a legacy model that you try to overlay onto new technology, right? So when you think about where eVTOLs are going, their ability to sort of unlock a lot of air mobility, both in an urban environment and in a rural to urban environment, it will take a different mode of thinking, and which is thus, Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation, thus the SFAR that was, they're in the process of adjudicating the comments, right? So we do need a different model as we go forward and say, what's the level of technology? What's the level of automation? What are the levels of redundancy? What is that equivalent level of safety based on where we've been with our legacy models, and how that, how we apply that to something that's new, right? That can also be used in a backward sort of engineering perspective to say, how do we get better at what we currently do today? Right? As we're thinking to the future. So,
Brad, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little on this one to ask how you see FSI fitting into training the new entrants.
So we are working with, in fact, we're working with Archer, we're working with Lilly, and we're working with a lot of them. And philosophically, I can say that this, I'm confident of one thing, that this is going to be a pathway filled with change as we go through the next several years. And so our philosophy is we got to be along and take that journey with our partners that are in it, so we can learn and not be 10 years from now saying, oh, that turned out pretty cool, and then knock on the door and try to get in, right? I mean, we have to be part of that painful journey with everybody else that's going to be on board. So we're participating as we can with as many as we can. A lot of that participation now is with simulator test articles, so they can develop their aircrew standards, their operating procedures with a very, very good tool that we can provide them. But we're also dragged into how you certify a pilot, and power lift. No, there's no power lift pilots type in that category today. So it's a very dynamic situation, but we're committed to be along on the journey and be good partners to them, because it's going to be an evolution, not a revolution.
Yes, there's a lot of innovations.
Yeah.
We're getting close on our time, so I'm going to go into a lightning round. I'm going to start at the other end with Alan, I think. Where is the most opportunity to make meaningful change in the training space?
Right now, what I will say is that for us, and we're talking about the pilot groups that are coming to our airlines, we have had, great success with the universities and the structured flight school programs, and, coming up with somewhat of a single pathway from those flight schools or colleges right into the airlines with some type of a structured program has been very successful for us. And looking at some of the other pilot demographics, they kind of start to deteriorate from that point. But, literally, as long as a person has gone through one of these collegiate programs or a structured flight training program that's of good quality, what we find is they don't have any bad habits yet. And they come into the program, they're easily trainable, they're still in the learning mode, so to speak, and very moldable into the new airline structure that they're beginning to join. And so those are the very successful people, and I think continued focus in that area would benefit us all.
Michael?
I'll carry on to that. We are successful as well. Unfortunately, we're recruiting the same pilot. We do have a significant advantage, though, through our Lift Academy. So Lift Academy, we train a pilot at hour 0 to eventually become an E-Jet pilot at Republic Airways, and they learn the Republic/Lift way from hour 1. So that makes that transition from flying a Diamond 44 or 42 into an E-Jet that much easier. And we tell them on day 1, our job is just like you started at Lift, is to get you 5 minutes ahead of the E-Jet. Now, 5 minutes ahead of a Diamond is like from here to the front row, where 5 minutes ahead of an E-Jet is from here to Dulles. But eventually, trust the process, we will get you there. So if we can create more of these structured environments from hour 0 to wherever that is, and make all of those pathways match, that makes it a significantly easier hill for that student to climb. Now, one thing that we have introduced to some of our 4-year schools is, it turns out, a relatively new concept to them, and that's threat error management. Threat error management is huge in the airlines, but we have realized that those that are coming from 4-year schools, whether it's the UNDs, the Purdues, and the Embry-Riddles, they may have mentioned it here and there in a class, but it is not ingrained into their programs like the way it is in the airline world. So going to ABI conferences and being on advisory boards, this is the big thing that we're talking about. Threat error management is CRM of 1980s. CRM is ingrained in everything that every airline does today. Threat error management needs to be that as well, and we need to start at the 4-year academy so they understand what that is as they advance their airline career.
What I'd like to see very quickly, I think one of the first acts of the FAA administrator, once he's confirmed, is to go back. We've already got the act arc. I say give them 180 days and come back with the recommendation that say, what does a standardized curriculum look like that you could then leverage, not have that be sort of individually vetoed by any particular constituency. Let's produce a body of work leveraging data, looking at every operating model around the world and say what really works, and let's move to let's let the data set us free. I think if we do something like that and then come back with a report to Congress in 180 days that here is a pathway forward or not, right? And then let's move on.
Dan?
I don't know how I can add on to that. I agree with everything said. If we could, I think if we can get SMS down to the individual level and start that in training and have pilots and training programs instill into the student pilot the risk management skills. It all comes down to, we've already heard it, 95% or thereabouts of incidents today are pilot error. So why isn't 100% of our focus on refining the pilot? That's the way it's going to get better.
And Brad.
Yes, it's. I think professional pilot development has been spoken to adequately. Maybe for the lifetime of the pilot, once he's a mature aviator, I think if we could have the latitude to focus on what the data is telling us is actually hurting people instead of the regulatory checkbox. You know, a V1 cut exactly at V1 has probably happened 0 times in the history of aviation, but we train it extensively. And so let's train runway excursions or upset recovery and other things that are actually hurting people.
That's all our time. I want to thank all of you for such a great discussion. So many ideas of things to take back as we go back to our regular jobs. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, man.